What's up, guys? It's bluetea-TCG back with another Vanguard deck profile, this time for V Premium. Today I'm presenting my Protect 2 Angel Feather build that I brought to locals today. I finished in third place with. And it's going to be based on the cards that we got from V Clan Collection Volume 6, which of course includes Circular Saw Kiriel, the new Grade 3 boss unit that Angel Feather got. In order to, push, excuse me, you didn't hear me say push. Never mind, I said support. Of course, I never said push there. It's Bushiroad's attempt at supporting Protect 2, a mostly forgotten strategy due to its inherent weaknesses, mostly being the fact that you have to have grade 2s in the field for the most part in order to make use of the benefits that you gain from Protect 2. However, because Protect 2 allows you to get a lot of shield value from your field, this means that you're allowed to avoid those nasty Garter Strikes which are currently dominating the metagame, such as those of Steam Maidens, as well as other decks that rely heavily on Garter Strix for their strategies. Of course, because this deck has a better matchup into Steam Maidens, I decided that it would be a good idea to show it off. And while I did finish third place at my locals today with this list, that locals did not have any Steam Maidens at it, so I didn't necessarily have a chance to test it out again in that matchup. But I have a good idea of how it would work for that matchup due to having played the matchup before with this build still. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the deck profile. But first, I do want to point out that if you haven't already watched kind of my previous V Premium deck profiles, where I talk about strategies such as the Gavril OTK, which involves now, of course, Mobile Hospital Feather Palace due to Hamiels being banned, as well as my deck profile on Celestials, which I haven't updated just yet for the new support, but of course, it still holds up to this day, I would say, with a couple of small changes perhaps, but yeah, I'll do an updated deck profile on that sometime soon, hopefully. But if you haven't already checked out those videos, please do so. The link for those will be in the description, and of course, you can find them on my channel homepage in the Cardfight Vanguard playlist. All right, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get right into it. So we've got, of course, Protect 2, which you need a lot of. Every time you ride Kiriel, it's usually going to be 2 Protect 2 markers, so you're going to need at least 8. And the reason why we're only running 8, or at least 8, is because we have only 4 grade 3s that we can even ride into in this deck. We're not really running any other grade 3s in this deck, so except for, of course, Heal Guardians. But Heal Guardians don't give you any Protect markers. So the starter we're running is 1 copy of First State Celestial Peniel. So this card is, of course, just the starter you have to run, so I'm not going to explain more about it. But the nice thing about it is that if you do go second and you ride Nakir or call Nakir eventually, you're able to, and you, of course, you find a grade 3 off of Nakir, then you're able to discard the quick shield that you get from this. So, of course, that's a really nice thing to keep in mind. Then onto the trigger lineup and other grade 0s, we've got 4 copies of the Heal Guardians. So Heal Guardians, I think, are still necessary right now, and you can decide whether to run a split of 20k shield heal triggers, or the full Heal Guardian lineup, or even the full 20k shield heal trigger lineup. But that's basically just personal preference, in my opinion. I do find having the 4 Heal Guardians helpful for this kind of deck, especially since we need to be able to survive that early game in order to make our grade 3 power spike turn more powerful, more effective. Because oftentimes you're not going to find yourself with many cards in hand at that point in the game, so you do want to make sure to have a high defensive power in as few cards in hand as possible. So this offers that if you're going second or if you stay on grade 2. And keep in mind, this deck's grade 2 game is actually pretty good, and it's built with that in mind just because we're running only 4 grade 3s. And the reason we're running only 4 grade 3s other than this Heal Guardian is mainly because most of the grade 3s don't synergize super well with Kiriel. Kiriel is kind of self-sufficient in terms of protective strategies unless you're running Malkuth Malek, which in my opinion requires a completely different build just because of the amount of support cards necessary for a Malkuth Malek strategy to work. But that's not to say that it's a bad card. It's just that Kiriel doesn't really need much help from those other engines and archetypes, so that's why we're sticking with the tight 4 grade 3 build other than the Heal Guardians. But again, having this Heal Guardian helps out a lot with surviving that early game. Next up, 4 draw PGs. So keep in mind that this is a Protect 2 deck, and you don't have any way of getting perfect cards unless you're running the PGs in your deck, so we need to have the draw PGs. Not to mention that, again, this deck doesn't build card advantage as easily as some other Angel Feather builds can, so you do need the draws in order to keep up with decks that can build those hand sizes, especially Excel 2 decks. They build cards in hand so quickly, so effortlessly with all the Excel markers they're able to generate, so you need to be able to keep up with them and stay on pace in order to survive through their turns. Of course, Excel matchups are still brutal for the deck. In fact, today I did lose to a Hamscape player in my final round, and that was the round where, you know, whoever won that round would get first place. So unfortunately for me, I did not get the W over the Hamscape player, but I will say, you know, PGs aren't necessarily incredibly good against the Excel matchup, but the draw power specifically is especially important because you want those extra cards in hand in order to defend those extra attacks that they're able to get. Lastly, for the other triggers, we've got 8 crits. This is your discretion once again. I do feel like this deck is a bit aggressive, especially on that power spike first grade 3 turn and subsequent turns thereafter. Every single turn you ride Kiriel is an emphatic amount of a power boost of, like, you know, power spike that this deck gains. And I think critical triggers complement it really well just because of the fact that you're getting those extra effective trigger checks with Kiriel every time you attack with it. And the more you ride Kiriel, the more of those trigger checks you can possibly get, just because it's possible for more of your circles to have protect markers on them. And keep in mind, Kiriel gets extra cards. Kiriel is able to call extra cards from the damage zone for every one of your circles that has a protect marker. So that means more opportunities to see these triggers and effectively, you know, overwhelm your opponent from early on. And in locals today, actually, it was interesting because when I rode into my first grade 3 turn, I had already checked about 3 critical triggers or so. But because of Kiriel's ability to, you know, check extra triggers on top of the fact that we're running a couple of damage checkers in here, specifically Japhkiel, I was able to apply a lot of critical to my rear guards, and it put a lot of pressure on my Jewel Knight's opponent early on, and basically suffocated him. Basically, like, he was able to get his first grade 3 turn afterwards, but it wasn't significantly threatening. And, you know, on the crackback, I was able to finish him off due to his being at 5 damage. Not only that, but because we're running a lot of beat sticks. And these critical triggers are really important for helping out those beat sticks reach their effectiveness as well as their kill power, because we're not necessarily running traditional finishers. There are a couple, but they're not what you'd expect. You know, usually this, of course, means that in the Protect Mirror, you're a bit it's a bit harder to get a proper finish. But with that being said, there are plenty of cards you can run and adjust the ratios for in this deck if you'd like to get exact finishing power in that sense. But usually just having the consistent B6 is good enough, and paired with these critical triggers, you're able to pressure your opponent early on, even on your grade 2 turns, even on your first grade 3 turn, because the amount of times you're able to check into these triggers is tremendous, especially thanks to Kiriel. So I think 8 crits is just about right for most Aid to Feather builds, and this, of course, this deck is no exception in that regard. So that's going to be all for the triggers and grade 0s. Let's go into the grade 1s. Starting off with standard stuff for Nakir. As I said before, we're running only 8 grade 3s total, 4 of those being Heal Guardians, and the other 4 being our boss unit grade 3 that we must see. Otherwise, we pretty much lose. Now, I will say that in my first round today, I faced Ultimile. I probably should have mentioned in the beginning of the video what my matchups were, but I'll go ahead and mention that at the end. But I faced Ultimile in round 1, and I actually did not find Kiriel before my first grade 3 ride. But thankfully, on my GSS, I was able to find it. But of course, my early Nakirs in previous turns whiffed, so you do want to be careful about that. But again, 100% necessary to run this just to find your important grade 3 more consistently, and that way you're not going to fall behind, you know, due to the fact that your opponent's on grade 3 and you're on grade 2. Now, those Heal Guardians are supposed to help a little bit, and you especially want to make sure to use them, because, you know, if you have them in your hand, then you won't be able to G-assist. So I made sure to use all my Heal Guardians while I was on grade 2 so that I'd be able to G-assist to find that Kiriel. So just keep that in mind. But of course, you can use this early on to find the Heal Guardians itself, or you can just find Kiriel directly, which is usually what you want to do. And also in the mulligan, you'll be hard mulliganing for Kiriel most of the time, just so you have in your hand to safely ride into when you get to that grade 3 turn. But Nakir also being, of course, 13k booster really helps for this deck's trying to hit big numbers. Oftentimes, the Kiriel column will be 35k, especially on the first grade 3 turn, thanks to the 13k booster, along with Kiriel's plus 10 bonus to herself for each protect marker, or plus 5 bonus to herself for each protect marker on your circles. And of course, after your first grade 3 ride, you'll typically have 2. So the fact that you stack protect markers so fast, as well as the fact that you have a lot of 13k boosters in this deck, means that we're able to hit big numbers from the get-go. So it's great to have Nakir in this deck. Next up, we've got 4 copies of Beriberi Beat Angel. At first, I thought this card was kind of not good, but then I realized actually that it plays an extremely important role not only in the early game but also in the mid to late game, due to the fact that it's so much effective shield value when it's on a protect marker. And for that reason alone, it's very much worth it to put a protect marker or protect 2 marker in your back row, just so that you can put Beriberi Beat Angel on it, and that way you have like a, what is this, plus 10 for each protect marker that's on it, and then plus 5 from its own ability. So that's already a 25k intercept from your field. Now, of course, if you're playing against a matchup that is able to retire your field pretty easily, this card doesn't become as valuable for the most part. But even in your hand, it's still a 10k shield, so it's not a terrible thing to have it run. And plus the fact that when we ride this on your grade 1 ride, it's pretty much the best card to ride as your grade 1 ride, just because we're able to go for a free +1 after we ride upon this into our grade 2. So that is extremely important for making sure that this deck doesn't lose in the card economy game from the early turns of the match, and also the fact that it helps you out in terms of giving you some extra shield value when you go into your first grade 3 ride is really important. Now, 4 copies is kind of up to your discretion. I do think that you want to see it as your grade 1 ride most of the time, so that's why I'm running 4 copies of it. But I think it can be safely run at 3, just because a lot of the times you really want to have those protect markers on your front row, and it kind of also helps your front row grade 2 attackers get to higher power bonuses, and of course it helps them with intercepting as well. But that way it makes your attacks a lot more threatening in that regard. So 4 copies of this card, I really like it in this deck. Obviously, it's the deck it was made for, which is a Protect 2. But next up, we've got some of the less common picks, maybe unexpected, but I think this is a powerhouse of a card. We've got 4 copies of Bellyful Angel and 2 copies of Aid-roid Lamedo. So the former card is probably my favorite grade 1 in the whole deck because it works extremely well with Kiriel. In the early game, we're able to find the pieces from our damage zone that we haven't already seen, such as, of course, the Kiriel, as well as a Freezing Granter or even a Shake Patch Angel for later on, and even a Beriberi Angel. There are plenty of cards you can search out from your damage zone using this card because of the free swap, and the fact that it's a free countercharge because it does not counterblast for its skill, plus it gives you some soul back. And keep in mind, we're running Kiriel, which requires a soul blast for its on attack skill. And actually, Kiriel and Freezing Granter are the only cards we're running in this whole deck that are soul blasting. But despite that, we actually run out of soul relatively quickly without this card. So I feel like this card is especially necessary for that. But why 4 copies, you might ask? Of course, I've mentioned in previous videos where I like running 3 copies of the hard ones per turns because it makes sure that your hand isn't as clunky. But for this deck, I think I like seeing Bellyful Angel as early as possible, just because it really helps out with finding the consistency of getting the Kiriel as in your hand, as well as the grade 2 pieces that you really like to see in your hand from as early as possible, such as Nurse of Holdheart, such as Shake Patch Angel, all of those cards. And oftentimes, if your opponent doesn't damage deny, it gives you plenty of more chances to get those cards that I just mentioned in the damage zone, and then you have this card in your hand, you're able to use it to swap every turn. And not to mention the fact that we're actually not running any cards that recover stuff from the drop zone. More on that a little later when we get to the grade 3s. But of course, running the 4 copies means that you'll have 4 chances to use this card throughout the game. So I do like it at 4 copies. You can decide to run 3 if you'd like, but me personally, I like having this from as early on as possible, just so that we're getting that more consistency due to the fact that we're running only 4 real grade 3s that we want to ride, which is, those 4 being, of course, the 4 copies of Kiriel. And then 2 copies of Lamedo. This card is phenomenal in this deck. However, I do not think that it can be maxed out simply due to the fact that it's not online for the majority of the game. Its Sentinel Restrict ability is only active when you have a grade 3 in your soul, which means that we'll have to have rewritten into Kiriel for its ability to actually be useful. Not to mention the fact that it retires at the end of that battle, which means that our uses of it are quite limited, and we don't want to be seeing it a ton when it's not actually online. So I do think the 2 copies is kind of the sweet spot. I was running 3 in an earlier build before the locals today, but at the last minute I decided to cut it to 2 to add that extra copy of Bellyful Angel, and I have no regrets so far, but we'll see how it goes from here on out. But again, this card is also one of our 13k beaters, just because it gets the extra 5k if a new card is put into the opponent's damage zone. And actually, that condition of a new card being put into the opponent's damage zone is not at all hard to fulfill, thanks to the fact that we have cards such as Freezing Granter and Nurse of Holdheart that allow us to control our opponent's field, put one of their rear guards into the damage zone, then usually they heal a face down card, of course, right? But that's going to be enough to fulfill the condition of Lamedo's getting that extra 5k. Speaking of which, instead of Beriberi beat Angel, if you don't like the fact that, you know, it needs to be on the field in order for its extra intercepting ability to go online, you can also decide to run Healthful Intendant, which is very similar in its role of being a good first ride target. And actually, the fact that Healthful Intendant is able to, you know, give you a +1 when rode upon without costing a counterblast is very huge, simply due to the fact that Beriberi beat Angel. We can bring this back up here just since we're talking about it. But Beriberi beat Angel requires a counterblast, which means that, like, sometimes opponents will damage deny. I will kind of tell you guys a secret, though. Not a single opponent damage denied me going into grade 1 or the grade 2 ride. So this effect was always online every time I opened it. However, of course, I only opened it in 2 out of 3 of the rounds. I did not open it in the Hamscare round, which is the round that I lost. So maybe that says something. But, you know, of course, having the ideal ride targets is always going to be ideal. So there's nothing really news to that. But regardless, I do like Lamedo in this deck. It's nice to be able to call it off of the Kiriel ability. That way you're able to give your newly built rearguard columns after ability the ability to guard restrict. And giving that to something like Freezing Granter or Shake Patch Angel is can be the lethal blow, because those numbers get really big, especially later into the game. And we'll talk about those when we get to them in the grade 2s. But yeah, Lamedo is a great card. You can decide to run other Sentinel Guard restricts that are available. I think one of the good ones that people are running is Amputation Angel, which is a grade 2 that you know, your opponent cannot call Sentinels if you have, I think, 3 protect markers or something like that. And that's online at around the same phase of the game as Lamedo is. So that card's really good. And it also gets like something like 15k power if you have protect marker on the circle, something like that. But they both fulfill kind of the same roles, so I think they're both great options as your finisher, as well as well, I don't know if Sima Peniel. So Sima Peniel is a grade 3 that if a new card was put in your opponent's damage zone, you discard a card from your hand, and your opponent cannot call Sentinels from hand until the end of that battle. The problem with Sima Peniel, though, is that it's a grade 3, which means that if you call it and your opponent's able to guard that attack, you're left with a grade 3 on the board, which means that you're losing some intercept value from your protect circles. So I don't really like that card as much, but I do think that it's like a fair enough option to run as your finisher. However, I do think Lamedo and Amputation Angel are much better options for that. All right, that's all for the grade 1s. Let's go into the grade 2s now. So to start off our grade 2s, we're going to start with something that is very often seen in any Angel Feather deck these days: 4 copies of Black Aculeus Japhkiel. So, funny enough, like I mentioned before in previous videos for Angel Feather deck profiles, this card is one of the best grade 2s. And actually in this deck, I don't know if I felt like this card is one of the best grade 2s. It's a card I like seeing, mind you. Like, of course, it helps with just, you know, going +1 and giving an extra boost to your magic numbers. But I also feel like there's enough utility in swapping in this deck already, plus the fact that Kiriel is able to make columns on her own, that Japhkiel doesn't feel insane as it does in your own Hamiel builds, such in other Angel Feather builds that are around. However, this card is still important to run just for the fact that it helps your card economy a lot. And especially early game, I think this card is still one of your best grade 2s to have in hand. And you want to, of course, use it right when you can. Of course, due to the fact that you're able to add additional cards to your hand and damage check, which can put extra pressure on your opponent. In fact, against my round 2 opponent today, who was playing Jewel Knights, having Japhkiel as my grade 2 ride, I think I rode actually Shake Patch Angel and called Japhkiel to rearguard circle. But having Japhkiel as the rearguard attacker meant that I was able to damage check and actually got a critical off of that, which means that it helped out for building my numbers on my grade 2 turn and kind of build an improvised rush on my opponent. That way it would add more pressure to them on my when my grade 3 turn came around. And because I went first, that means there were 2 back-to-back pressure turns for him to have to deal with, and it made it that much harder for that brutal Kiriel turn with Freezing Granter and Shake Patch Angel swinging for huge numbers like 50k. You know, it made it that much harder to deal with because a lot of times people take the damage early on, And I made him bird a PG thanks to the fact that Japhkiel had, I think, 3 crit at that point. I got a crit off of the Japhkiel effect, and then a crit off of the Shake Patch Angel drive check. So it forced out a PG from him early on, which meant that was one less PG for him to have on the first Kiriel grade 3 turn, which those attacks are a lot harder to block, and I was able to get crits on that turn as well, thanks to the fact that you're able to effectively trigger check 4 times with that on your first grade 3 turn with Kiriel. So it's great to have this card in the deck to support all of that. But again, I feel like, the fact that there's so many grade 2s that complement with Kiriel so well makes it such that this card is actually not the most insane card for this deck, but it's still great to run, mind you. So we're still running it at 4 copies. And then next up, we've got one of my favorite cards in this deck. In fact, probably one of the most flexible cards to pair with Kiriel in Protect 2 build, 4 copies of Shake Patch Angel. So Shake Patch Angel does something that not many cards in Angel Feather do in V, and it's allow you to go +1 immediately into your grade 3 turn. Because this card reads when it's rode upon, you can put it into the damage zone face down and then call a card from your damage zone to the rearguard circle. Now, of course, as I mentioned with Beriberi Angel, who does a very similar thing, and even Healthful Intendant, who basically does the same thing as well. When you're doing those on your grade 1 turn, going into your grade 2 turn, it's not as impactful despite it being +1, just because sometimes your opponent can decide to damage deny you, and the most you get out of that is, calling Healthful Attendant from your soul to your rearguard circle in effect. But with Shake Patch Angel, this basically directly supports your Kiriel turn. You're already getting a grade 3, you're already getting a grade 2 beat stick right from the get-go when you ride into Kiriel, when you have this card as your grade 2 ride previously. Basically what the combo is you'd have this on your Vanguard circle. You ride into Kiriel, you get your protect marker and all of that. Let's go ahead and put the protect marker there. Then you would use Shake Patch Angel, goes to the damage zone, call it back out because of its rode upon skill. And then, of course, you use Kiriel's ability to counterblast, get into the protect marker. You can put it here or here if you'd like. Let's just put it here, for example. And, of course, the fact that you're getting both of these protect markers and you can potentially put them on Shake Patch Angel means that you have a huge beat stick already. This Shake Patch Angel, let's say you have 2 damage in damage zone. This Shake Patch Angel will have an additional +3 for each card in damage zone. So that means it's going to be at +6, which is 15, and then you add another 10 from both protect markers, which is going to make it at 25k by itself. And if you have a 13k booster, such as Nakir, let me pull out the Nakir. If you have a 13k booster like Nakir behind it, that means you're going for 38 on your first grade 3 turn. And that's not all. You can decide not to boost with a Nakir, and then when you attack with Kiriel, you're able to counterblast, soul blast, all that, and call whatever you have in your damage zone over the Shake Patch Angel or somewhere else. It's up to you. Let's say you have another Shake Patch Angel, in fact. You're able to call this over and get another attack that's basically equally as threatening. On top of the fact that you have the damage checks. So this card being basically a free body for a beat stick to complement with your Kiriel first grade 3 turn means that the deck can do so much in terms of putting pressure on your opponent from early on into the game. So I really like this card, and I feel like it's probably one of the best grade 2s that we have access to support what Kiriel does for this deck. Now, do keep in mind that if you're not able to ride this as your grade 2 ride, your plays are not as good necessarily. Let's say you ride into Japhkiel, for example. Japhkiel is obviously still a great grade 2 ride, but you'd much prefer to ride this just because of what I just mentioned. However, if you're not able to ride this, then you still have other cards such as Freezing Granter and Nurse of Holdheart, which also have Vanguard abilities, and you can, of course, adjust the card you ride based on what your opponent has on their field. The aforementioned 2 cards both have the ability to effectively control the opponent's field by putting one of their rear guards into the damage zone, and then your opponent heals a card from the damage zone. So if you feel like that would be more effective in terms of, based on the matchup or based on what your opponent has on the board if they decide to rush you, then those are cards you can also ride into. But if you have both that and Shake Patch Angel, I feel like this card is always the one to ride just because of, the free body that you get with Kiriel to support that first grade 3 turn beatdown with Protect 2. Not to mention the fact that after you call over the Shake Patch Angel with, say, another grade 2, that means you're going to have another card to intercept with, which is going to be intercepting for as much as 25k shield if you'd like off of that first grade 3 turn, which is phenomenal. Of course, your opponent might decide to attack into it, but keep in mind it's going to be a 19k base power because of the extra 5k given on both your turn and your opponent's turn for each protect marker on that circle. thanks to what Protect 2 can do. So, Shake Patch Angel, phenomenal again, and I feel like it's one of the best cards that supports Kiriel and what she does, and of course, just for Protect 2 in general. Next up is 4 copies of Nurse of Holdheart. So this card is one card I admit I slept on for a long time. This card is amazing. It's basically like a Nociel, so Love Machine Gun Nociel from before V. So the original one that has 8k power, because it allows you to swap effectively for free. Now, of course, it only swaps when placed from hand, which is a bit of a bummer, but Kiriel doesn't allow auto abilities to trigger from its ability anyway, so it's not like we're really going to make use of that. But the fact that this allows you to swap for a counterblast on a non-once per turn, no once per turn whatsoever, means that this card is basically almost always good whenever it's in your hand. The only time where I'd say it's not good is when you need some extra shield value in your hand, which means that you basically be forced to call this in order to swap into something with greater shield value. But how is that a downside? I mean, you can still call over it with Kiriel once you activate its ability after you've attacked with this, let's say. Or you can just decide to leave it on that intercept circle that has a Protect 2 marker on it, and still intercept for whatever the value of those Protect 2 markers that you have on the field is. So this card is just incredible, and I didn't even mention the fact that it can choose one of your opponent's rear guards and put it into a damage zone, effectively like, Angel Feather's flavor of retiring, if you swap a grade 0 into your damage zone. Now, do keep in mind, swapping a grade 0 into your damage zone can kind of conflict with Kiriel sometimes, just because, those grade 0s are not as incredible to call from Kiriel as a grade 2 would be. So you do have to kind of choose between, do I want to remove an opponent's rear guard, or do I want to get an extra grade 2 in my damage zone that I can call off of Kiriel? That trade-off is always something I think that's difficult to reason through on the spot, and that's probably something that lost me the game in round 3 today. I decided to use Nurse of Holdheart's second, basically, full ability in order to remove my opponent's one of my opponent's Ham's grade 1s. And it turned out that when he rode it to his grade 3 turn, he was able to fill his whole board back again, which, I sort of anticipated. But regardless, we live and we learn. Swapping into a grade 0 into the damage zone means I lost shield value in my hand in order to add a grade 2 back, which is kind of terrible. And I had to end up calling over the Nose of Holdheart right away in order to make up for that lost value. So it ended up going, minus in shield value overall and to not much gain. So you do want to be careful about getting greedy and using the full extent of this card's abilities. However, of course, having that flexibility is still just phenomenal. It can't be understated how important this card is for flexibility and utility in this clan. And I can't believe I slept on it until now. I mean, it's great in this deck, not just in this deck though. It's also a solid card to run in V Nociel. Now, I do want to show off V Nociel in a deck profile in the future, but I haven't polished a list up yet. So once I do that, I'll make sure to release a video. But this card is just amazing, and it's one of the cards that you absolutely do not mind seeing on your first grade 2 turn. And even from then on, if you decide to, or not decide to, but if you're forced to stay on grade 2, maybe because you haven't found a Kiriel or haven't found a proper grade 3 to ride, this card allows you to kind of extend how long you're able to stay on grade 2 while still keeping up with your opponent, just because it offers that utility both on Vanguard and Rearguard Circle on and on once per turn. So amazing card. Last but not least, 3 copies of the greatest beatstick of all time. I'm saying that half jokingly, but this card is amazing. 3 copies of Freezing Granter. So Freezing Granter is a card from originally VBT06, or is it VBT06? It's VBT07, sorry. It was in the same set as Healthful Intendant. And I believe also Ergodiel was in there as well. But this card reads, when it's placed from hand, you can Soul Blast 1 and remove one of your opponent's rear guards, meaning like just put in the damage zone and then your opponent's uses guard from the damage zone heals it. Same idea as Nose of Holdheart. However, for this card, there's no condition. You just Soul Blast and it just does it. Which means that if you place it from hand, if you have enough in your hand, it offers the same amount of control that Nurse of Holdheart can offer, while also being a beat stick thanks to its second ability, which reads, when it attacks, you can counterblast 1, and this unit gets plus 5k until end of battle for each face-up card in your opponent's damage zone. That ability alone is what makes this deck very scary when you're getting those Kiriel multi-attacks. The whole idea of Kiriel, right, is that you're able to you're basically able to fill up new columns mid battle phase upon Kiriel's attack. And those columns, generally, you want to put them on on circles with protect markers on them, so that you can benefit from the small but significant power bonus that protect 2 circles give you. And the fact that Freezing Grantor gets +5 for each face-up card in your opponent's damage zone means that those 5Ks add up very fast, and it can spell trouble for your opponent if they don't have enough shield value in their hand. Now, of course, they can all be circumvented by a simple PG, but thanks to Aid-roid Lamedo, which I mentioned earlier in the Grade 1 lineup, we're able to make Freezing Grantor shine at what it does best, which is creating huge columns that your opponent has to hard guard, which is kind of one of the reasons why I'm not running Amputation Angel. I feel like the combination of this and Lamedo is already basically enough for accomplishing that finishing. And it's not like you really need the Sentinel Restrict all throughout the game. You mostly just need it for when your opponent is at 5 damage and you're trying to finish them off. Because oftentimes, the goal of the earlier grade 3 turns is just to burn enough cards from your hand. That way you're not as behind on card advantage, since this deck is not really centered around card advantage necessarily. It's mostly just about being an aggressive Protect 2 deck that can offer a lot of shield value from the field and make use of those grade 2s to complement Kiriel's on attack skill the best we can. So keep in mind that because Kiriel does not allow for auto abilities when its skill activates, we want to make use of that by running a lot of these beat sticks that are not on place abilities, but rather on attack abilities or just continuous abilities such as Shake Patch Angel and Freezing Grantor, which is why we're running those cards at all. Now, this is one of those cards that I've almost run 4 copies of, and I think it's running 4 copies of it is fine. But I also feel like it's better to just have the 4 copies of Nurse of Holdheart because it's a more flexible card. And beat sticks, beat sticks are good, but they're not like crucial to have all throughout the game. I think having them in select instances is when beat sticks kind of shine the most, in my opinion. And the fact that we have 4 copies of Shake Patch Angel, which we have to run 4 copies of that because it's our best grade 2 ride target. But since we already have that form of beat stick, and of course Shake Patch Angel's maximum power off her own skill is an additional +15, which makes for 24,000 power. So obviously not as big as what Freezing Grantor can get, but just generally speaking, I feel like it's fine to just have the 3 copies of Freezing Grantor. I've not been too troubled by it, but I do not think that 4 copies is necessarily a bad thing to have for this deck. Some of the other beat stick options that you can run for this deck, as I mentioned earlier, like Peniel, Amputation Angel, they all kind of accomplish something similar. But the fact that this card becomes scarier the later in the game you get means that I kind of like it a little more. I mean, additional 25k power is nothing to disrespect. Your opponent has to respect it. They have to have cards in their hand to guard with. Even if it's a mere PG, and of course, if you're afraid the PG, make sure to call Lamedo or have Lamedo in the same column as the Freezing Grantor when you go into Kiriel, just so that your opponent has to really respect it. And that counter +1 in order to get the extra power boost is very cheap. There's nothing really, that's not a real cost in my opinion. I mean, it does all it needs to do, and it's so easy to get counterblast back. We're not really using counterblast that much in this deck, or if we are, we're getting them back right away. So, great card in my opinion. All right, and last but not least, this is literally the last card in the deck. We're running only 4 grade 3s, all of those 4 being Circular Saw Kiriel, which is the new boss unit from V Clan Collection Volume 6. This card is very good actually, but my opinion is that it had to be good. Otherwise, because Protect 2 is just not as good as Protect 1. Protect 2 is probably the worst gift marker in the whole game, and in order for it to even be reasonable to play, you have to make good cards like this that just do so much on their own, but only work with Protect 2, because they're trying to push it. And of course, you didn't hear me say push at all in this video. All you heard me say is support Protect 2. With that out of the way, I do want to point out a couple of Kiriel's most important abilities. Obviously, her most important ability being the fact that she has an on-attack skill to rebuild your columns based on the number of your circles with Protect markers on them. And typically, the number of circles with Protect markers on them doesn't exceed 3, just because you're usually going to stack all your Protect markers on these 2 front row rear guard circles. and perhaps one of your back row rearguard circles that's going to have Beriberi Beat Angel on them. But also, Beriberi Beat Angel is not often seen in those phases of the game, so you don't want that protect marker to go to waste. So basically, my advice is that you only place one of those protect markers in the back row if you have the Beriberi Beat Angels all in rotation, or at least you have them in line for rotation for at least 2 consecutive turns. If you have only one Beriberi Beat Angel in line, then I'd say it's just better to put the protect markers on the front row circle at that moment, and then from there you're able to decide whether it's worth proceeding into back row protect 2 marker for Beriberi Beat Angel to stay there, in the off chance that your opponent decides to go into a finisher. And this is especially important in the Steam Maiden matchup because you do want to have those high shield value intercepts available on command. You don't want them to be stuck somewhere where you can't access them. So I think that's where it's useful to be able to put those extra protect markers in the back row. But the fact they're able to generate protect markers at double the speed of ordinary grade 3 rides mean that this card, obviously carries the deck, right? But it carries protect 2 on its back, meaning that we're able to reasonably build a deck that can run protect 2 without, being annoyed at the drawbacks that come with it. And then the second ability is during our turn, it gets plus 5k for each of your protect markers, which means that, basically every turn, this card is going to be swinging for an additional 10k, which can be extremely frustrating, extremely scary for your opponent. And this is why this deck has such a strong first grade 3 turn power spike, because of the fact that your numbers are automatically ameliorated by 10k in each of your columns. Or not 10k in each of your columns. 5k, it really depends on where you distribute your protect 2 markers, but typically it's going to be 5k on both of your front or rear guard circles, and then 10k, of course, for Kiriel because of those two. And those are very those numbers are extremely significant. They make a real difference in terms of how your opponent decides to guard. Typically, in that stage of the game, people want to guard because they know that the later game they'll have to take a lot of the damage in order to live the big numbers that a lot of decks make. But in the case of this deck, despite the fact that they want to guard, the numbers are so big in the first grade 3 turn that they end up taking a lot of it. And that means that once you get into your second Kiriel, for example, the Lamedo becomes that much harder to deal with. The Lamedo, the Shake Patch Angel, which is going to be buffed by more depending on how much damage you're taking at that point. And then, of course, the Freezing Granter because your opponents had taken that much damage. So, again, that second ability, phenomenal. But obviously the third ability is the highlight of this card. So let's go ahead and read it. When this unit attacks, counter +1, so +1. Choose up to the same number of cards in your damage zone as the number of your rearguard circles with protect markers. And notice how it says the number of your rearguard circles. It doesn't say the number of your protect markers. So keep that in mind. That's a little different from the second ability where we gain +5 for each of those protect markers. That third ability only calls the same number as the number of your rearguard circles with protect markers, meaning that if you're stacking your front 2 rearguard circles with the protect markers, you're never going to get more than 2 cards called off of this ability, which is generally fine anyway, because the main idea is to just refill the columns in your front row with additional beat sticks to further threaten your opponent. But also, if you happen to get a third in one of your back row circles, let's say, if you have a Beriberi Beat Angel, then of course you're able to call 3. And remember, for each of the cards you call, you're going to deal 1 damage to this unit. So that means an additional trigger check. And oftentimes you do want to cycle through your deck a lot faster, so you're able to see those triggers more easily. So having that third protect marker in one of your back row circles is 100% fine for that reason alone, because additional card you can call and an additional card going into your damage zone for a potential trigger to be seen off of that. So oftentimes this card basically becomes 4 trigger checks in 1 attack. Phenomenal card. And keep in mind that cards' auto abilities do not activate from this call. So that means anything that has an on place activated from it, or any auto ability that triggers from a unit having been placed in such a manner. This is a very important thing, guys. Like, let's say, of course, this is V premium, so you're not going to see a card like this. But let's say you have Nurse of what's it called? No, okay, that's not a good example. Let's say you have something like Salafiel. Salafiel is not going to activate from the call. That is the Soul Blast 1, Heal 1, Deal 1. As well as cards that say, when your unit is placed, this card gets +3k. Nope, auto abilities do not activate from this call. So you got to make sure to line it up with cards that are able to do something on their own, maybe when they attack, or maybe when or maybe it's a continuous ability. That way we're able to still make the maximum, benefit out of this card without being held back by the fact that there's a restriction on auto abilities when you call the units from the skill. So with that in mind, we're able to run cards such as Shake Petrino, as mentioned before, and Freezing Grantor that make the best use out of this, in my opinion. And of course, cards like Sima Peniel and Amputation Angel are also good ones for this card. Now, I do want to mention one last card that perhaps people don't typically run in any Angel Feather deck at all, but is a reasonable enough option to run. And that card is Bosker Surgeon Asphail. So I mentioned a little about Asphail earlier. This card reads, when it's placed on the Vanguard or Rearguard circle from hand, you counterblast 3, heal 3 cards from your damage zone, and choose 3 cards from your drop and put them into your damage zone. So one issue with this deck is that, of course, since we're running only 4 grade 3s that are actually reasonable to ride, you can often find yourself in a position where you don't have enough gas for later phases of the game if you never see enough Kiriels. And actually this happened to me in my round 1 match today when I faced Ultimile. I actually found only 1 Kiriel the whole game, and there were a lot of turns. I don't remember the exact number of turns the game had off the top of my head, but we went to time and a little bit, over the time. We had an additional 4 turns to complete the game, and we basically took 3 out of 4 of those turns. So the game went on for a long time, and I was stuck on the same grade 3 that I rode, which was only that 1 Kiriel. So I think having an additional grade 3 like this can actually help a little bit just for lengthening out your ability to stay alive for a game. And a card like this especially allows you to refill, like if you place it on the rearguard circle, let's say, it allows you to get back those cards you have in your drop zone, like grade 2s that you've already used before because you called over them with Kiriel's ability, and then put them back into your damage zone. That way Kiriel has some additional cards to attack with when the game kind of lengthens out for a long time. Now keep in mind you do need 3 face-up damage for this ability to be live, but I also think that 3 face-up damage is not that hard to come by because we have plenty of things that are able to countercharge, and we're not actually leaving counterblasted cards in the damage zone very often anyway. So I think this is a very reasonable card to run, and the cost is not really something that is a bottleneck for it. However, I don't think this card should be run at more than 2 copies for all those aforementioned reasons. And I don't think this is a card you ever want to ride anyway, even though it's a grade 3, just because Kiriel is so much better to ride. But I do think having this additional card to call on the rearguard circle means that you're able to, let's say you call this, you use its ability, of course, you put some grade 2s back in the damage zone, you attack with this, and then you're able to call this over with the grade 2. That way you have that grade 2 as actual shield value for your following turn when you have protect 2 markers on that circle. So I do think Asphail is a great option. And I do want to talk about another card that I think is a great option. And that card is Cosmo Healer Ergodiel. So I kind of briefly mentioned Ergodiel when I was mentioning the set from which Freezing Grantor came. But Ergodiel is basically one of those cards that you can ride into, perhaps on your first grade 3 ride or your second grade 3 ride, just as a way to further control your opponent's board and get some power out of your Vanguard's attack. Now I will say, again, it's still way better to ride Kiriel itself, but the thing that Ergodiel allows you to do is get a crit to your Vanguard, basically right on the spot at the cost of a counterblast of 1. And then the fact that it also gets extra 5k when it attacks for each card in your opponent's damage zone that's face up, similar to how Freezing Grantor gets that power bonus, means that if you have this with a boosted Lamedo, that means you're able to hit high numbers while also having a guard restrict on top of that. But sometimes it's just better to have Kiriel on the Vanguard circle just because it's able to do a lot more on its own. But it's also just not uncommon for Kiriel to not be seen at all. So if you want some extra redundancy in a card, then I do think Ergodiel's not bad for the job. But I will say it's just always better to have the Kiriel. So if you just want another card to be able to ride just so that you're not scared of having the 4 grade 3s in your deck, then I think Ergodiel is a fair enough option. Along with maybe Asphail and some other grade 3s that are available, such as Metatron. I will say Metatron has kind of fallen off lately. I don't think it's still that good of a card to run, just because of the fact that it has to ride upon a grade 3 for its skill, for its good part of its skill to be online, meaning that you're never going to be riding it as your first grade 3 ride. So I don't know if it's really worth running over any other grade 3 that you can possibly run alongside Kiriel in this deck. So with that being said, again, Urgodio is a great option for that. And there was another grade 2 I had mentioned earlier, and it's Amputation Angel. So the thing about Amputation Angel is that, again, it's a grade 2, which means that, complements extremely well with all that we're already running with Protect 2 and Kiriel, because we're able to call Amputation Angel off of Kiriel. And the fact that Amputation Angel's abilities are all, they're all continuous. I don't have the copy of Amputation Angel on me right now, but the fact that they're all continuous and it gets a power bonus on its own for just having 3 protect markers, which means that on your second Kiriel ride, you already have that fulfilled, means that it's able to hit high numbers as well. But I will say, I think just running the Lamedo is, typically good enough, especially at the copies we're running them, because we're cycling through our deck a lot anyway, and by the time we need Lamedo or any other kind of a guard restrict, the Lamedo will show up for the boost and provide us what we need. And the fact that we're able to boost with it means that we're able to combine it with Freezing Granter in the aforementioned manner from, a while back. And that means you can also combine it with a card like Urgodio, as I mentioned already, and even Kiriel. In fact, having it with Kiriel was one of the ways I was able to threaten my opponent in round 2. That was the Jewel Knights matchup. But I don't want to keep this video super long. I just want to make some last comments before I close it out. I want to talk about kind of how the locals went. So the whole idea for building this deck was to counter Steam Maidens, because Protect 2 is a great way of circumventing the guard restricts that they, onslaught you with from the get-go. And what it turned out that happened was that not a single player at the locals today brought Steam Maidens. So I was a little bummed in some senses, but I was also, I guess, relieved, because, Steam Maidens are a bit of the most, toxic V deck right now, I suppose. And, it's been storming this BCS season as well. So I just had to bring a deck, that would have that in mind and, have some preparations for it. But it turned out I didn't face it, so I guess we were safe from that. But in terms of my opponents today in the rounds we've had, so there were 10 people at the local. There were a total of 3 rounds. I faced Ultimal first round. That was a win. And that one went for a long time. We went into time, as I said. There were 25 minutes in the round, and we went over that. We had to do the extra 4 turns that they gave us, and we went up to those 3 turns. Fortunately, I was already in a winning position by the time the time extension was given. It was basically a matter of outlasting him, making sure that his card advantage was not exceeding that whatever I was generating. And thanks to all the Japhkiels that I'm running, thanks to the Bellyfuls as well, we're able to make use of all the utility that's in this deck, alongside the beat sticks that are provided from Kiriel and Freezing Granter and Shake Patch Angel as well, in order to constantly just pressure him every turn and slowly whittle away at his defenses that were weakening as the game continued to go on. So that was a favorable position for me the whole time, but I will say that it was a bit frightening to not have seen more than the first Kiriel that game. So I was a little shaky there, but it ended up working out. And then round 2, I faced Jewel Knights, and I'm familiar with how Jewel Knights work in Premium, but in V I wasn't sure how exactly they would roll, so I was a little bit scared at first, but I did remember that Protect is kind of favorable for, Force is rather favorable for Protect in general, so I just had to keep my cool and make sure that I would apply all the pressure I could early on, and so I did. In fact, because I went first on my first grade 2 turn, I had both Japhkiel and Shake Patch Angel, which were both able to swing for a 1-2 punch, thanks to 2 criticals that I pulled during that turn. One thanks to Japhkiel, and the other thanks to my drive check from my Shake Patch Angel Vanguard's attack. And because Shake Patch Angel gets an additional power bonus for each card in my damage zone, despite the fact that he's a force deck with a little bit higher than average base power, I was still able to make some good numbers that were able to put a lot of pressure on him, and even got a PG out of him from early on. I will say, though, my opponent did not find, I believe my opponent did not find a single Heal Guardian, so that was a bit unfortunate. In fact, I think I saw a total of 3 Heal Guardians of his go into the Soul, so obviously that didn't sound like good news at all. So a bit unfortunate in that regard, and of course, Kiriel overwhelmed him on the subsequent turn, alongside the Freezing Granters and the Shake Patch Angels. It wasn't enough to kill him that exact turn, but it put him at 5 damage, which meant that the following turn was going to be brutal, because I was riding into Kiriel again, and getting the Lamedo. I was threatening the Lamedo Guard Restrict, which actually never even happened because of the fact that I attacked with Freezing Grantor first on my rearguard circle, counterblast for its skill, got it to about 50k power, 54,000 be exact, and he had to take it knowing that he couldn't guard everything that turn, hope for a heal trigger. Of course, by then he'd already had 3 heal triggers going to his soul, so it was looking really rough for him in that sense, and that was sealed away on that second grade 3 turn. And in terms of how this deck defended against the Jewel Knight's grade 3 turn, it held its own pretty well thanks to all the intercepts I had on my board from the Protect Markers being built. I was able to pretty easily deal with the attacks without having to use too many cards from my hand. On top of the fact that my hand quality was very good, I had, I think, a total of 3 PGs in my hand. Obviously, super good. So that'll be trouble for any Force deck in general. So we took that game pretty comfortably. And then round 3 was against Hamske, and I had played against Hamske before, but I don't know if I had the right combination of cards in my hand or board in order to properly finish the Hamske player off before the Hamske gets their power spike. And as such, when it came to the grade 3 turn, even though I went first, I got the Hamske player to 5 damage, despite the Hamske player not having heal guardians to fend off that onslaught. Because I didn't finish him off, the following turn, my having a lot of grade 2s in my hand meant that I wasn't able to cleanly defend against the multitude of attacks that Excel decks can typically generate. And this was no exception for Hamske. In fact, Hamske can build a board without having too much in their hand. And actually, following that first grade 3 turn that I did, he actually had only 1 unit on the board, I believe. Or maybe no, it was actually 0 units on the board. But he was able to build his front row all back thanks to the card he rode onto with, I don't remember what it's called, but basically it's like Counterblast 2, discard a card, and fill your board equal to the number of your open front row rearguard circles, something like that. And that meant that a lot of my hard work in terms of removing his units was moot. But I also should have been a little wary because I had, as I mentioned briefly in the beginning of this video, I had used Nurse of Holdheart to swap a grade 0 unit, which was a trigger unit, into my damage zone in order to remove an additional one of his rear guards. But that turned out to be one of the crucial pieces I needed in order to defend the subsequent turn. And the fact that, he can just rebuild his board anyway from having had open rearguard circles meant that there was no real point to doing that. But even with all that said, if I had just had a few more grade 1s, like maybe 2 in my hand instead of 2 of the grade 2s that I had, I would have been 100% fine. I would have survived that turn and would have killed him on the crackback. And I even had Lamedo and another Kiriel in standby for riding on the next turn. And, of course, having Lamedo boost behind the Kiriel is often, the end of the game for several decks. But alas, we live and we learn. There was a lot of moments where I could have done better, but in the end, the Hamske player got the best of me and actually took home first place for that tournament. That was the game that determined whether I would get first place or he would in the local. And I finished 3rd with the deck. I didn't have too many high expectations. I did, of course, hope to face a Steam Maiden player to confirm that this deck was indeed the deck to beat Steam Maidens, but of course that didn't happen. But I'm still, satisfied enough with the 3rd place finish with this deck. I do think Protect 2 is still copium at best in terms of, Vanguard in general. It is by no means superior to Protect 1, but Bushiroad has tried their hardest to really make strong cards to, support Protect 2. But in the end, we're stuck with this. And, I'm not too disappointed with Kiriel. Kiriel is a flat-out amazing card. But I will say I'm a little disappointed that you do have to build a deck around her for her to be very good. But all that being said, she is a good card. So I do think they did her justice with this retrained for V. And I'm excited to have finished with the way I did. And speaking of finish, I do want to pull out the promo, one of the promos that I got today. And this is the promo I want to try out potentially in a future build. Although I'm still not 100% sold on it. So that's why I didn't talk about it in detail when I showed the earlier cards in this deck profile. But this one card is one of the V promos. It's called Forceful Therapy Assail. And this card reads, when it attacks from the rearguard circle, it's an auto ability. When it attacks, if a new card was put into your opponent's damage zone this turn, you Soul Blast 1, and until the end of the battle, it's a 2 or more guard restrict. So I find that interesting for like an alternate finisher besides Lamedo. and it's a grade 2, and it complements well with our other cards that can, remove cards from our opponent's field and put them into the damage zone, because this card ability goes online from that. And the fact that it's an on-attack ability means that it works perfectly with Kiriel, but because it doesn't have enough of a power bonus on its own, meaning it needs some kind of support from Protect 2 circles or from the boosting unit such as Nakir or Lamedo, that does kind of mean that it's a little bit tricky to make it work super well. And I do think outright Sentinel restricts are much better because, Sentinel restricts means that if you have high power numbers, your opponent's forced to hard guard it. Whereas with this card, all they have to do is guard with 2 more cards. I guess this could be good though, if you get it to like a sweet spot number that your opponent can't easily intercept with, then they have to use 2 cards from their hand, which could be cards that they don't want to use, because they want to save them for next turn or something like that. So I'll try it out and see how it works, but I'm not 100% sold on it. But I did find it interesting because when I read it, when I pulled it from the promo pack and I read it, I thought, hey, this is not too bad of a card for the Kiriel strategy. So I did want to point that out. But yeah, guys, that's going to do it for the deck profile. I know that was a long one, but I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope it gave you some ideas for how to run Angel Feather these days, especially with Protect 2 being further supported in the latest sets that Angel Feather had support in. And of course, look out for future Vanguard deck profiles and a couple of Yu-Gi-Oh videos I'll be uploading in the near future. I have a lot of those lined up, but still got to finish editing those. But with that out of the way, thanks guys so much for watching. If you like this video, please feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more Vanguard, Yu-Gi-Oh, all of that kind of content. I'll continue, of course, churning out all those content as I can, as I get the time to. And yeah, thanks guys for watching again, and I'll see you the next time.